I would now like to introduce today's presenters. Jimit Arora, partner, leads Everest Group's practice focused on serving enterprise customers. This responsibility spans Everest Group's research offerings focused on executives in IT, sourcing and vendor management, and shared services. Rohitashwa Agarwal, Vice President, is a leader in Everest Group's global sourcing practice. In his role, Rohitashwa is focused on engagements and initiatives with global companies that focus on GBS shared services centers. Amir Khan, Senior Analyst, is a part of Everest Group's Enterprise Talent Excellence practice. In his role, Amir is focused on engagements and projects that focus on key aspects of talent research. And with that, I would like to turn things over to Rohitashwa.
Hey, thanks, Raphael, and a very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody who's joining us today. Today's topic is very pertinent and very relevant. We have been hearing a lot about impending recession. There is a lot of news out there. Many companies are already starting to react. And to those who are particularly operating in the global services space and have been facing a lot of challenges, particularly with regards to hiring for the technology talent, and it's not been easy over the last 1 to 2 years, it is but natural to start thinking about, will this recession, however negative it may be, create some relief on this front? Will it solve the talent problem that we are facing? So today, over the next 50 plus minutes, me along with my colleagues, we are going to share our perspectives on this topic, and some of the key questions we'll try to address is, will the recession really solve this problem? What are the skills that are in demand? What are the locations that are emerging in hotspots? And as you can imagine, probably we are emphasizing still a lot on the solution. So you can imagine parts of the answer there, but how can you continue to be employers of choice or improve your ability to be employers of choice as you operate in this very competitive market? Without further delay, let us go on and let me share what is going to be the structure of the session today. We will use the first part of the session to share some of the statistics and some of the trends from market, which help us determine, is recession coming for real? And does this impact the demand for tech talent? And if so, how? In the second part of the discussion, we will actually focus on some of the guidance and some of the provocations for all our listeners today to cover on what can you do as you continue to operate in this environment. And towards the end, we will save some time for live question and answers. I would encourage everybody to keep submitting your questions via chat during the session. We may answer some of them live, but towards the end, definitely we'll look forward to addressing some of that. As we get started, let me start by asking a question to all our listeners today, right? So on the next page, let's just quickly do a quick poll. Before we uncover our point of view, what do our listeners feel? What is your current position on the tech talent? Do you think you're already planning layoffs, or on the other end, you don't think there is a possibility of a recession in the near term?
And Rohit, I'm starting to see some of these results come through. It's gonna be interesting, right? So of the options we provided, I think we're gonna have a clear winner, right? I won't give it out, but okay, now we have one option at least across each of those 5 choices that we gave, right? It took forever to get at least one answer on the first one, which is planning, implementing layoffs, right? But as we end the poll shortly, I think we have it done. Yeah. So there's a fairly unanimous opinion. So the good thing is that we aren't really seeing a lot of layoffs either in planning or implementation phase, right? About 16% are saying that there's a hiring freeze that's either been established or about to be established. The continuing hiring but reducing hiring demand is probably the one that surprises me the least. And in some ways, you'll see a sentiment of that play out in this webinar as well. And then glad to see a fair degree of optimism in this group as well. So about a quarter of the audience is saying, if you look across the last two, using market conditions as an opportunity to double down, right? So it's kind of buy the dip kind of a mindset that some of these organizations are using. And then also a fair degree of optimism. Don't really think a recession is going to be here in 2022, 2023. So very, very interesting to capture the sentiment of the audience as we've started. With that, maybe let's just reflect on what we've seen here, right? And if you think about what's happened to the talent market, the last couple of years have been an absolute roller coaster, right? And if you're in a position which is implementing HR policies, talent acquisition, talent retention, we salute you. Because there's been so much work that has had to happen over the last, I want to say 30 months, right? So we started, of course, March 2020, onset of the pandemic, the work from home scramble begun, but there was a lot of uncertainty. There were job cuts, furloughs that happened. Not as much in the knowledge economy, but if you think about the sentiment at the start of, Q1, Q2, 2020 was pretty grim. As you think about what happened as an aftermath of that, H2 2020, beginning 2021, there were a lot of layoffs even then. Companies moved to a period of a hiring freeze. So we had layoffs, hiring freeze, back to a hiring surge. So we started doing a lot more. Most of 2021 and what we've seen the first quarter of 2022 kind of characterize the phrase, the great resignation, pent-up demand. We see significant attrition, wage inflation happening. And this whole period, I would say the last 18 months or so have been characterized by a significant talent shortage. So again, the whiplash continued. And now, right, if you think back to the question at hand, there is this possibility of a recession, a lot of economic uncertainty. We've seen some hiring freeze happening. So far, we haven't seen massive layoffs. There was like 1% of this audience believes that's going to happen. And then again, we are entering a period of volatility. So what we wanted to do was at least provide our perspective in terms of, hey, is the recession truly coming? And most importantly, will it solve the talent situation, the talent crisis that we find ourselves in, right? So if we think through some of the economic indicators, and you'll have seen this before, we don't, there's so many people who've looked at this across a variety of dimensions. Some of this information got updated since we prepared these charts as well. Inflation's been high globally, right? So we've seen a lot of high inflation in Europe, seen a lot of high inflation in the US. If you think about what that did to GDP, we've had now, so this chart has data through Q1 of 2022, where the real GDP contracted. Q2 as well, the real GDP contracted. So we did meet the technical definition of what a recession is because we've had 2 successive quarters of GDP contraction, right? So in some ways, and this is what's really driving people crazy, right? Because it's a very different environment that we find ourselves in, which is on the one hand, we are seeing real GDP contracting, hiring indices are really high, and that's why it's causing confusion. What's a real recession versus a nominal recession? In the US, at least, the declaration of a formal recession is yet to happen. So there's more around that. Obviously, there's other parameters as you think about treasury yields have seen a lot of volatility. Last time we saw that was happening in the 2008, 2009. And interest rates continue to be on an upswing. And at least in the US, the current guidance has been that we are not going to be softening that posture anytime soon. So if we look across all of these indicators, I believe what we are seeing is fundamentally an environment which suggests that we are moving towards a recessionary outlook. Rohit, why is that different than from why we've been having this debate? This seems fairly cut and dry to me.
No, that's a good question, Jimit. And if I start looking at some of this data, it just feels like that everybody is already cutting off, right? We have some names from the largest tech firms to the banking institutions to some of the largest tech services providers. Almost everybody is seeing a need to control costs, reduce hiring, reduce staff. Just today, a few minutes before the session, there were more news coming in from some of the largest American financial institutions who are going to be starting to fire a certain section of employees. Some of the most covered CEOs around the world in the last week have made statements around need to clean up. So definitely, and I agree with what you were saying before, right? It seems like it is setting in. And even from a hiring perspective, there is a lot of news, but for some reason, Amir disagrees with me. So let me ask Amir why.
Right. So Rohit, this is very interesting. If you look at one side of the coin, people are very cautious about the recession and the fear of recession. So they are cutting down on hiring. But it is interesting to note that on the other side, there are several employers who are very optimistic in hiring. Even if you look at the US job market in July, they have added more than 500K jobs. And even if we talk about the service providers, the top service providers like TCS, Wipro, they all have projected good guidance. They have revised their guidance to a higher value. And the main reason is that they have a good projection of demand. So they're keen to hire. They don't have any option rather than going on and hiring multiple. So I feel that this is a very strange situation where the attrition is high. There is still a war for talent, but the demands are also on a higher end. And so this pattern continues and people are still keen on hiring. So that makes it a little interesting, the entire scenario at this time.
And Amit, I think that's a great point, right? Because and we look at the services industry as a proxy for the demand profile. And in some ways, the fact you articulated is at the center of the debate around here, will we or won't we have a recession, right? Because GDP contraction terms, yes. What's been so different this time versus every other time is what you just mentioned. The number of vacancies and therefore job growth is expected to sustain and continue, right? And we kind of see some of that also in the outlook for the services industry, which acts as a proxy in some ways for what's happening to demand. And what you can see is that this particular feature, at least over the last 2-3 quarters, has been on a complete upswing. The market is expected to see growth, which is higher than, so obviously the comparisons versus 12 months ending March 22 had a base effect, given that this was compared to the peak of the COVID crisis. But even versus prior years, which was pre-pandemic, it's a very healthy growth profile. So we continue to see optimism here across the stack.
And Jumit, while you talk about optimism, some data which is not at all optimistic, but backs up what you and Amir just said is that we looked at the attrition trends. We've been tracking them very extensively. And even if we look at the second quarter of this year, for some of the leading technology services providers, attrition continued to increase. There are a couple which observed a marginal dip, but broadly, and as you said, this is a great proxy for what's happening out there in the rest of the IT talent market as well. The demand profile continued to increase, the attrition continued to increase, and it is showing in the data. We are in the last quarter of this, we're in the last month of this quarter, and we expect this to either marginally dip or sustain in this quarter, possibly a marginal dip, but nothing close to what companies would really like. Hence, our conviction that the demand for tech talent is not really dropping. And some more data on why we say that. If we move on to the next slide, right, not just looking at the data which shows attrition in the last few quarters, But putting it together across key geographies, and we are looking at almost 15 leading markets for technology talent globally, there are several data points which we have tried to capture in here. The person with arrows on, 4 arrows around them, is the data point around attrition. The logo in the middle, the face with the plus sign, is the growth in each of these markets in the last year. And the last point, a person with those circles around them, indicates the unmet demand. And that is the number of vacancies as a percentage of the technology talent base in these locations. And to explain the color coding, the more red you see, the more competitive that market is. There is significant scarcity for talent. And if you take a step back and look across the globe, there is a lot of red in there. So employers across locations continue to struggle. This has been and continues to be a truly global problem. But of course, there are some local flavors, right? Even when I look at some aspects, you see, okay, where do I spot a lot of or fair bit of green? These are smaller markets like Jamaica, or some markets in Philippines, Malaysia, where the growth is still uh, kind of, not increasing the competition by leaps and bounds for tech talent. But at the same time, if you look at the markets like India, even where attrition is very high, sometimes it feels like, okay, unmet demand is bad, but not very bad. But recognize that this is over a base of a 4 million technology talent cluster. So there is still a lot of demand. And some of the things we are going to cover as we proceed is, this is happening because there is a gap in the demand profile of talent required and the profile of talent in supply. So while there is a lot of technology, there are a lot of technology graduates emerging, the mismatch between what is required and what is available, the quality of the talent, and the need for hiring talent which is immediately project ready. Organizations are no longer trying to fill positions for the next 2 to 3 years and train talent. They are already behind. There are critical projects which are delayed. There are transformation initiatives which need to be implemented now. Hence, the focus on hiring from your peers is kind of creating that vicious cycle in the industry, which is creating high attrition, high unmet demand. In fact, there is a bit of a phantom demand in there because everybody continues to anticipate greater attrition and is trying to backfill it proactively by opening more positions, and it's kind of adding fuel to the fire. Uh, so those are some of the key trends from a talent perspective that we see across different markets.
Yep. And again, I think we examined this from a number of dimensions, right? We looked at, hey, what's happening to economic indicators, what's happening to job growth, what's happening to attrition, what's the instances of labor market situation across different geographies. So our webinar today was about, hey, we are planning for a recession. Is the war for tech talent finally over, right? I'm sure you guys get annoyed when there's an "it depends" answer. So on the first part where, hey, is there a recession? I'm going to say maybe. I'm giving you a cop-out answer, right? We're not economists. The Fed Reserve is going to come out and declare whether or not we're in an official recession or not. Nominally, we've met certain standards of the recession definition. What's so different this time is how the job markets are behaving. What we can tell you with utmost conviction, which is why the first word on this slide is conviction, is that the war for tech talent is not over, right? And why we say that with conviction is we've modeled out different aspects of technology across applications, DevOps, data, infrastructure, cyber, and overall, right? And yes, there is going to be a bit of a ramp down in that slope of curve, which is the demand versus supply gap. So that demand versus supply gap will narrow. It'll probably narrow faster than what it would have if we weren't in this current economic environment. But even till 2024, that gap does not fall below 10%, right? So for every 100 jobs out there, there's just 90 people from a supply standpoint, not till 2024. So we're going to be this structural imbalance for tech talent, right? And in some areas such as DevOps, data, cyber, that gap is of course going to be higher, right? So sorry to be the bearer of bad tidings, but at this point, we can say that we expect, and we have a strong conviction on this, that this war for talent will continue. The contours of that war change, right? And we probably have more time to prepare, which is probably why what we're going to do for the remainder of this webinar is to talk through what are some strategies you put in place to make sure that you are coming out of this stronger over the next several quarters and through the rest of 2023. With that, maybe we can go to the next poll that we had here, right? And you know, we believe that there's significant challenges. So I want to understand, what do you believe are the biggest challenges in addressing your organization's future talent need? Is it just limited supply, which is a numbers game? Is it a quality issue, wage inflation, attrition, L&D? So you know, you can select your best option.
And Jimit, I see a fair number of. I was saying I see a fair bit of responses pouring in, and I think not surprising, but rampant wage inflation continues to dominate, followed by the quality of talent and attrition sort of in similar ranges. So it is and this is where I think the situation is very complex and painful. It is a matter of how much we pay. We still don't get the quality we need, and we don't get the numbers we need, or we don't get to retain when we hire them. So the problem is multi-layered, and it is at an acquisition step. It is even when you hire, you break your cost bands, and then because you can't retain, it impacts the overall ability. Slightly surprised with a couple of responses, to be honest. The quality of the talent available at entry level, while in my experience, I've seen the numbers are available. Quality of the talent coming out of the campuses is a big problem. Not meeting the right kind of quality that can be project ready or ramped up sooner. And at the same time, the lack of investments in L&D. So what will be interesting to also see if there are any questions or comments later on is, does everybody believe that L&D initiatives are well funded, or are the audience of an opinion that they are not required and hence lack of investments is not a problem? I think it will be interesting to see what people feel, because again, while the focus on L&D has increased, we saw almost a 2 to 2.5 times increase in investments in L&D in the last 1 year. So probably organizations believe they're well covered. But without further delay, let us go on. And as you said, Jimit, let's talk about what we recommend organizations to focus on in this environment.
Well, so this brings us to our first provocation, where we believe that a targeted acquisition and a reskilling strategy is very crucial when we are actually looking to target certain roles which are at high growth and high attrition. So what is that strategy, and how are we actually going to build that? Before we step on to that framework, let us look at how the roles have changed, right? And how the perception of roles have changed. So if I talk about the perception before 2010, we see that there were defined clusters of roles based on different functions, different brackets of roles, which are very well defined. But if I talk about the roles of today, the shift is a lot more on a skill based. We have seen with this rampant digitalization, digital transformation taking place across the industry. So the roles definition has changed from a cluster based to skill based. And if we see across the industry, not only IT, across the industry, people are learning behind the same roles, right? So this has further complicated this entire scenario. And this is one of the major causes that we are seeing this stretch of the talent war. Right? So before we come to the next slide and I give you a way out on how can we actually figure out this, So let us look at what could be the change in the roles post 2022. So if we look at the right hand side of this chart, this table, we see that there are a lot of new emerging roles. We are listening about metaverse, we are listening about 5G, AR, VR, crypto, blockchain. And so we can see a lot of new entrants popping up in this list. But not to mention, not to forget, there are certain roles of today which will continue to be a major chunk of the requirement of the industry. For example, full stack, DevSec, cybersecurity. This will also be a part of the roles of tomorrow. So this is very interesting and crucial to identify in order to maintain a pipeline for tomorrow. And I think the time that we're going through right now is a great teacher, to actually build our pipeline for future. So let us come to the next slide and we'll try and see how can we actually figure out this. So if we look at this particular graph, let me give you a little brief about this graph. So what we have done, we have tried and mapped a subset of the roles that we were showing in the previous slide from the roles of today and the roles which are expected to be on high demand in the future. So as you can see on the x-axis, this shows the attrition in the last 12 months, right? And on the y-axis, we're looking at the growth rate. So the entire idea here is to measure the growth versus volatility to actually see if we can target some of these roles and have a definite set of strategies for them. Is it possible? Let us see. So we did this experiment with a subset of 25, 30 major roles. And it was very interesting to actually see that some of these emerged in the top right-hand side of the graph, which are actually showing very high growth over the years. But on the other hand, the volatility is also very high. So this cannot be fulfilled only by external hiring. And there are initiatives which need to be taken in terms of L&D so that we can build pipelines for the future. And we have seen this through our conversations in the market, that companies are keen on hiring roles for the future in large numbers more than their requirement. They're investing a lot on entry-level investments, trainings, and creating an L&D. Even that was seen as a problem in the last poll also. What I noticed that that also emerged the challenge, in the quality of entry-level talent. So that could be one alternative. What about the midsection, where we see the major chunk of the roles? If you look at the size of the bubble, I believe the major chunk of the roles which are required in this industry comes in the middle section. So, which we have classified as moderate growth and high volatility. Although the growth has been pretty moderate, not very low, not very high, on the moderate end, but the main challenge is volatility. We are seeing so many shuffle in the position, people are leaving for higher pay, and they're leaving. Again, they're creating this void, which is again a pain point for the companies. So I think a better strategy for these roles would be a combination of acquisition and internal development. This both should go side on side so that we can actually create a pipeline for the future, not missing out the opportunities of the present. Right. And if we look at the third category, which have a pretty low growth as compared to the other roles, maybe that could be primarily dependent on external hiring. And so I think in a nutshell, net, what we feel that a data-driven approach where based on our requirements, if we could classify the roles into different categories, that would really be fruitful, in the long run to build our pipeline, not compromising on the needs of today.
I think you make some really great points on this. One of the key things that we've seen over the last 24 months of volatility is a lot of focus on external acquisition. I know in the poll that we just did, the audience felt that L&D was not a big challenge. Our provocation here is get precise and scientific about where you apply which strategy. But we also believe that a lot of future talent development will happen from within. Reskill, upskill becomes very important. So scaling up L&D is going to be a big priority for the near term, right? With that, I think it's also, I also kind of wanted to call out one of our special offers for today's session. It's in the chat window as well. You can sign up. So if you are a technology leader, HR leader in a large enterprise managing a big group of tech talent, right? We are doing a complimentary employee benchmark. Earlier this year, we published our reports on top employees for tech talent, right? So if you were not featured in that, what we are offering here is a custom report and a custom readout, which allows you to understand how you rate from an employee value proposition standpoint across 5 countries, US, UK, Poland, India, Philippines. You can select up to 4 peers of yours that you want to be benchmarked against. And we'll set up some time to walk you through the benchmarking results. We've developed a fairly interesting methodology to do this. And the offer should now be in your chat windows. Awesome. With that, right? And I was just speaking about employee value proposition, and we'll show some of the results there. But the second provocation, as you think about what's really going on, one of the things, and this is where we're trying to get more of the Gen Z into the workforce. We think of making purpose your superpower a key provocation that IT leaders, HR leaders need to have. And we believe that being purpose driven, focusing on culture as a key mindset pillar of all of IT becomes important. If you think of the IT mindsets we've been inculcating in our organizations thus far, it's been about, hey, let's be customer centric, cloud first, in some cases, cloud only. We want to be security obsessed and data driven. Our provocation today is to add this fifth one: focus on purpose, focus on culture, which will allow us to kind of address some of the key challenges that the poll had highlighted, which is, the inability to get good mid-management talent because they were leaving in droves. And purpose is going to be the key differentiator of the companies that come out successful as part of these talent wars. And why do we say this, right? We did some research as we kind of look at some of the data underneath on the next slide. I mentioned that top employees for tech talent. We did this across banking, insurance, technology. And if you look at the factors that contributed to the highest employee satisfaction, it came down to purpose and culture, highest correlation. Close behind was senior management, right? If you look through the list, by the way, that's also very telling. Career opportunities, work-life balance, compensation and benefit, fifth on the list, right? So for those of you who are kind of betting the farm on saying, hey, we'll buy our way into success, our provocation would be make purpose a key dimension of your employee value proposition. That's what's going to help you fix the attrition problems. That's what's going to make it easier for you to hire and attract the best talent.
And Jimit, just building onto that, another invitation to all our attendees today is that we did this top employers analysis not only globally for the top technology organizations, but we also did it with a very specific focus on the GBS organizations, which is Global Business Services, all type of in-house captive shared services setups that organizations have. We analyzed 200 plus organizations across India, the Philippines, and Poland, which are the top 3 GBS or GIC market locations. We shared the results of that analysis in a webinar about 10 days ago. But what is really interesting is that now we have practitioners, leaders from some of the organizations who came out on the top, and they are going to be sharing their secret sauce of what helps them be distinctive, stand out, and what are some of the best practices that they adopt to build that very distinguished employer presence in these markets. So there will be a link in the chat. We encourage everybody who finds this topic relevant to share, to kind of attend and listen in, and there will be a live Q&A during that discussion as well.
I think that would be great, Rohit, to hear from some of the top employers what have they done differently, and I think that will be really good for this present audience also. So with that, we come to our third provocation, and this is very interesting because we have been talking a lot about hybrid, and I'm pretty sure all the leaders present in this conversation today have been thinking on defining strategies to bring back people back to the office. What should be the actual target days? And should it be fully remote or hybrid? So let us look at some data to actually see what is the expectation of employees first. So this is from a survey conducted by Microsoft this year, where they analyzed people on their, basically this is an employee pulse, but they wanted to see what is the preference of employees. Are they looking for fully remote job? And this is not surprising, because if we look at this, except for a few European countries, all the major markets have a tendency for fully remote. And if I were to include hybrid plus full remote job preference, I believe that this would go beyond like 70, 80%. So here we are with the expectations of the employees. What is their expectation? Now the question is, are we as employers meeting the expectation of the employees? Do we produce enough remote jobs and are we ready to take this again, not going to back to the normal scenario and going back fully remote? Are we ready to take that? So let us try and see what is the current situation worldwide. So what we did, we tried to map a certain set of 10 rows across the geographies, some of the common rows, and we tried to figure out what is the tendency worldwide. And there were certain very interesting results that came out. So if you look at certain markets like North America, LATAM, we see that the prevalence is pretty high when it comes to being fully remote, open to fully remote. On the other hand, if you look at European markets, again, mid to high, not very bad in terms of being open to full remote. But if you look at Asia Pacific and Middle East Africa, I think they're not doing very well when it comes to being open to full remote, except for a few exceptions, of course, like Philippines, who have recently revised their some internal government policies, and they are now more open to remote jobs. Earlier, they were also pretty closed and this criteria. So I think this could again play a very interesting role and a major crucial role in attracting the right talent at the right time. And this can be a differentiating factor, because we have been talking about hybrid, coming to the office back again, being more collaborative. But what we are not considering is the sentiments gap. Are we as employers following the sentiments of the employee? Are we doing a regular pulse check on our employees, what they actually want, or a market check? What are the new potential candidates? Are they looking for fully remote or they're looking for hybrid? So our proposition, our provocation on this part is that we feel that still there is some gap. And if this could be addressed, maybe that could act as a differentiating and contribute something more towards, being able to pull that extra talent to a particular company. Rohit, Jimit, any other thoughts on this?
I know there was a question in the audience, sorry, Rohit, about this, right? And is hybrid the answer? And I think that some of the successful ones are taking it a step further and saying, hey, we are committed to a fully remote model for some portions of the talent to be able to access it, right? So we aren't saying hybrid is going away. All we are saying is having the flexibility to have a portion of your population be fully remote gives you an edge, both in terms of acquisition and retention.
Absolutely. And I think Jimit, and I think Jimit, maybe, I'm not sure if this has happened or not. This is basically a question to all the participants. Can there be a targeted approach for certain roles, which are difficult to actually get in the market, being more open to those roles? I'm not sure. This is just an open end thinking. I'm thinking out loud. We tried to see some pattern, could not get a very detailed, clear-cut pattern on certain roles, which could be put forward as full remote to attract. Rohit, what's your thought on that?
So definitely, I think this is an important angle, a competitive advantage, in fact, to attract talent. And that is where, while Jimit is saying, take a step forward and commit to the long-term remote working model, there are some external factors at play. For example, there are the economic zone authorities in different countries, which are coming up with norms that might complicate decision-making there. But what we see definitely in the short term, and something that I see from a lot of green on your slide here, Amir, is that companies are not waiting for certainty if this is going to be a long-term solution. But in the current competitive environment, how can they use it to their advantage? And personally, we have seen many examples of companies doing different forms of this, trying to hire remotely at a very different comp and ben level, which was again a question, has not been a great idea. If in case certain employees are seeking it as an exception and they are willing to make some compromises, that's okay. But as the market continues to be competitive, companies are actually kind of paying similar salaries. Of course, there could be some cost of living adjustment, but not really a major distinction in remote workers and employees who come to office full time or are in hybrid. Okay. Moving on from here, it is not only about hiring employees remotely, but also casting a wider net. So what we've also seen is the strategy, that Jimit, you like to say more is more. It has truly come, into display in the last several quarters. And one of the angle is how companies are expanding beyond what have been the traditionally large mega hubs for technology talent to kind of prepare for the long haul target tier 2, tier 3 locations. Let's look at some data on the next slide. This is a fairly busy slide, lots happening there. But if I were to, I would cover the key themes, right? So if we look at the chart on the top left, we are looking in the dark blue in terms of where most of the organizations have set up their centers historically, and what we call as the emerging hubs, where at the top you will see across captive centers and across third-party service providers, the share of these new locations in the new setups for technology services delivery has been continuously increasing. And if you look in the middle column, you will see some of the names at the top and at the bottom. Are companies moving away from the top 10? Not really. They are adding the next 10 and many more into the mix. What is equally interesting is that if you look on the second chart, the share of the tier 2 and tier 3 locations in the new IT setups has been on the rise as well. Across captive centers and across service providers, the third-party service providers, IT services providers, much more bullish and willing to invest in creating that delivery ecosystem in tier 2, tier 3 markets, which are relatively greenfield for this kind of work. But even on this GBS enterprise organizations, we have seen this as a secular trend. You see a minor aberration in the 2021 data that we believe is because of some setup challenges in COVID. Companies decided to operate closer to locations where they're fairly familiar with. But at the bottom, you'll see the overall trend is kind of fairly strong across third-party organizations and the GBS organizations. Now, on the next slide, we have also analyzed some data beneath it. What are these locations? What are those hotspots that are coming up? They may not be the silver bullet you need for today. They will not solve your talent needs beyond a certain scale. However, if you're looking at a 3 to 5 year and an 8 to 10 year horizon, these are some of the locations where we see most investments by global organizations. And as you will see, there are new locations that are popping up, or locations that are witnessing significant new activity. And we have highlighted a few, whether we are talking about the likes of Visakhapatnam or Ahmedabad in India, whether we are talking about Quezon City in the Philippines, or in the Central Eastern Europe, where we are looking at Timisoara. We are looking at other locations like, Reading and Kaunas. They are all kind of witnessing significant increase in activity. And if you look at the logos in each of the region, there is a good combination of global organizations, but this is dominated with leading technology services providers. As I said, they operate at a larger scale. They have a larger room to invest and build that ecosystem, which is required in some of these greenfield locations. And also their location footprint is much more extensive than some of the enterprise captive organizations. And hence the need for them to be in some of the tier 2, tier 3 cities from a long-term perspective, gain that competitive advantage has also been on the greater side. So do watch out for some of these hubs as you look 5 to 10 years down the line.
Yeah, and Rohit, this is fascinating, right? So lot of good strategies in there. Let's make sure we are very precise in how we attract and drive our interventions. We spoke about purpose. We spoke about exploring a fully remote strategy. And then most importantly, how do we move from just tier 1 cities to expanding to new geographies, right? To future-proof that talent supply chain. All of this screams investment, right? And what we really recommend and what we've said in the past, we also saw this happen during the COVID situation recently is, hey, don't waste a crisis. Capitalize on this uncertainty. There are going to be some companies who will not be as aggressive. This might be a time to get a leg up, to catch up on our shortfalls, right? And if we think about the strategies that companies have, it kind of falls into four broad buckets, right? And it's a function of how good's your financial position, and from a strategy wise, how well are you doing, right? Strategic position is fundamentally driven by your tech expertise, your client positioning, market positioning, industry exposures, etc., right? If you're in a position where financially you're strong, the strategic intent is really preserved, go on the offense, right? And this is the time when, for those of you not in technology, try to see if you can go after the talent in big tech potentially and see what really allows you to capitalize on the slowdown. If not, right, there's other strategies, which is, hey, you can invest to grow. Think of capitalization of certain expenditures, which would allow you to make longer term bets. One of those situations is we see a lot of companies right now. Yes, they're seeing some uncertainty on the y-axis, but because they are very well capitalized, we are seeing them make investments in newer geographies. There's a lot of new GICs, captive centers being set up, new GBS centers being set up in tier 1 and tier 2, 3 cities using build, operate, transfer models where pertinent. But we're seeing a lot of investments to growth that are happening. And then a lot of this is how you find ways to fund the transformation if necessary. Obviously, the lower left is the posture we wouldn't want any one of y'all to be in, which is the cutback posture. Thankfully, this audience, going back to the first poll, isn't seeing as much. So that's the set of choices we have. And of course, success will be a function of the choices you make. If you can play offense, if you can invest to grow, nothing like it. Rohit, closing thoughts?
And I'll just summarize, some of the key messages that we have shared is one, where Amir started on highlighting those particular skills and your strategy. So you need absolute precision in your acquisition and reskilling strategies to differentiate. You can't just paint everything with the same approach. As you said, Jimit, culture and purpose is very important. In fact, this has been a differentiating factor when it comes to acquiring and retaining talent. So this can be the superpower you are looking for. I don't do a lot of these silver bullet suggestions, but yes, this is one. Third, even if you don't have a long-term strategy, can remote working strategy be a competitive edge in the short term? Something to consider. Fourth, it's not just about now. We saw there are structural gaps in talent demand and supply. So as you look forward, what are those new hubs that you should be investing in? And fifth, as 1/6 of our audience said during the first quick poll, this is the time to double down. So make sure you have a strategy where you're not letting this crisis go waste. You have a plan to capitalize on it, even if you are comfortably placed. With that, we are at the closure of the planned presentation for today. As Jimit mentioned earlier, I would like to remind everyone about the offer we have for all the enterprise side IT leaders who are listening in today. Knowing how you compare in terms of perception of your organization as an employer for tech talent is important. And you can get your benchmarks done complimentarily. Pick one of these locations, name 4 peers who you compete with the most, and we will share a complimentary report with you and also schedule a readout session for you to share the implications and then a discussion with our experts. That brings us towards the end of this session, and we have a little less than 10 minutes on the clock. Let me open it up for Q&A. I see a long list of questions in the chat. Jimit, do you want to bring that up?
Sure. So, there's one that I see here, which is around do we believe that there is a requirement? So with regards to skills demand, do we think academia and industry need to collaborate better to meet curriculum that meets the needs of the industry, right? State level, college level, universities. So Rohit, what's your thoughts on that?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, lack of programmatic approach in this area is something that continues to baffle a lot of leaders. It's not a new problem. For years and decades. Possibly, we have seen the gap in the quality of skills or the nature of skills needed versus being produced from campuses. So, and I'm not talking just about the top tier one, right? I'm expanding it beyond that. So there is a need. In fact, in our recent research, we have covered how many of these organizations are partnering beyond their hiring drives to actually co-create those curriculums and improve the readiness. Because think about it, if you could hire graduates who take a few weeks and they are project ready, what else do we need? So absolutely, there is a need, and happy to talk more about it. We have done some research on what's happening in that space.
Perfect. I also see another question in here, which I'll attempt, and Amer, Rohit, either of you can kind of join in, right? Which is, how are companies really factoring the cost savings of remote workers? Are they increasing wages to increase retention, right? And I'd say that barring a couple of examples, I won't take names here, but barring a couple of examples where people were giving adjustments as, say, folks from New York, San Francisco, high cost tier one cities moved to lower cost locations, they adjusted their salaries accordingly. I'd say most companies are not necessarily making those retrospective adjustments, right? So from a cost standpoint, I do not believe that we are seeing people reduce or penalize employees meaningfully. They're seeing this as a way to get better access to talent, right? In terms of, are they increasing wages to increase retention? I don't necessarily think that that's true just for remote workers. Yes, we are seeing that. In fact, that was probably the highest cited challenge that we were seeing in the poll that even we conducted here. So yes, wages are going up. So yeah, I think that the economic factors here matter, but what also matters is the ability to access talent. And that's part of the reason why, Rohit, on your slide, where we are seeing so much more work in Asia and Africa, is because yes, there is cost arbitrage, right, which was something that we always used offshoring and nearshoring for. But now what we are seeing people are using these destinations is for talent arbitrage, which is you're going where the talent is, right? So availability considerations today are trumping cost considerations.
I absolutely agree with you. Just only comment I'll add is that even if there are some of those cost of living adjustments, what has also been proven is that a fully remote model is even then a predominantly remote model, but there is need to invite those employees in, whether on a monthly basis, quarterly basis. There is need for some travel, support home infrastructure, make investments in your cybersecurity and other infrastructure. So from a cost to company basis, it is very, we are not seeing a significant saving potential if a portion of your workforce is remote. So coming back to what you said, Jimit, this is a talent play, not a cost play. Cost savings may be incidental, but that's not the primary goal we see most companies leading with.
Yeah. To add on, Rohit, to just add on a sentence on the same, even I remember from a recent market conversation which I was having, companies are looking for investment levers, not only in terms of wage inflation, but other levers also where they can invest. So they are still open to spend more money. In spite of the rising inflation, they are still open to spend money, either wage inflation or any other investment levers. Rohit, like you said, right?
Yep. Just an add-on, and I'll probably take us to the last question, which was, hey, what is this doing to the reduced cost from facilities? I'd say that yes, that's been a question that's come up, especially in external models, where people are using third-party labor, and then the economic model is constructed keeping in mind savings due to reduced use of facilities. I think that applies in situations fundamentally where people are able to let go of the big leases that they might be in. So it comes down to whether or not those realized savings are happening or not, or if there's avoidance because you didn't have to add more capacity. So I do think that there are real cases where savings from facilities are genuine. In a hybrid world, of course, it comes down to how much optimization you can drive in your real estate stack, right? So, and then also because leases can be long term, some companies are further ahead versus not, and they're using some of these savings to fund the increased travel for more collaboration that Rohit just mentioned. Rohit, this is the last question that we probably have time for, 3 minutes out, which is, hey, to what extent are we seeing a shift towards freelancers, or the gig economy as we call it? And do we see the gig actually helping us or impacting what we are seeing on the attrition side?
This is a very interesting question, Jimit, and 2 or 3 different data points that I'll share, as I share my perspective. So one, definitely the adoption of gig model, both from an employee perspective and employer perspective, has been on the rise. In fact, in our analysis, Jimit, you may recall, we used to have a small sliver in the entire talent fulfillment pie chart of everything which is clubbed under the aggregate less than 2% of the total tech talent market. And gig is now popping up to have that lower single digit share, but it is starting to show on the radar, right, meaningfully. What has happened is that organizations with a lot of immediate need for some project-specific skill transformation talent, or a short-term need, 6 months, 12 months, where they're finding it difficult to hire even in their geographies they operate in, are reaching out. For examples, tech organization in India hiring from Europe, many other markets. So gig is on the rise, more adoption. There are many organizations who are starting to facilitate hiring through the gig model, right? The likes of tech services providers, Deloitte, Wipros, they all have a version of this, but increasingly there are those specialist gig providers who are also popping up for supporting a lot in this area. So that is also on the rise. From an employee perspective, this is still a model which we see more prominent in developed economies, more of a US, Europe market, selectively in Asia. In many of the emerging markets like India or Philippines, even some of the other Central Eastern European, we see employees predominantly preferring a more stable full-time job, but increasingly, in very small numbers, making that shift to gig. It is also becoming a challenge in some areas where moonlighting, dual jobs is emerging to be a problem, but that's a very small portion of it. Still not a big challenge, but yes, you need to watch out for this, especially if your gig workers are working remotely, which is the model. So your full-time employees are also sometimes moonlighting. So slightly complex with those challenges in play. Jimit, anything you want to add? I think I tried to cover it from many different angles, but anything to add before we wrap up?
No, I think that was a good summary. We are at time here, and I just wanted to be respectful of everyone's next calls. So thank you for the participation here. Everyone will get a copy of the document. And for those of you who've requested the benchmark, our team will be in touch to kind of understand those components and scheduling benchmark readout. So thanks for your time, and good luck as we enter these interesting times.